So today we are going to be talking about families. So we're leaving the first three chapters, which were the foundation chapters, the biological changes, cognitive changes, and the social changes. And as I've said before, everything in adolescence is happening at the same time, right? So it's not like the biological changes happen, followed by the cognitive, followed by the social. They're all going on at the same time. And they all have impacts on all these other aspects of the adolescent's life. And so families, of course, are going to be impacted when one member enters into adolescence. And of course, in some families where there are multiple children, you may have multiple different people at different stages of adolescence. And as a parent, I think that's the time that you want to just go escape to a remote colony somewhere and let them fight it out to the death and come back when it's all over. But again, we're gonna take a look today at what goes on in the family. Again, thinking about when one member enters adolescence, so it goes from childhood into adolescence. But remember, of course, that in some families we're gonna have multiple people going into adolescence roughly simultaneously. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of, is conflict between teenagers and parents inevitable? Whatever TV shows, movies, books, whatever you read that characterizes the relationship between teenagers and their parents inevitably shows conflict. The thing is, there's conflict between children and parents. There's conflict between adult children and parents. We are humans who always seem to find ways to create conflict with other people. So it's not that adolescence is the only time in a person's life that they're going to have conflict within their families and conflict with their parents. So one thing is, we know that the data show that this idea that adolescents and their parents are in constant conflict is grossly overblown and in fact not accurate. And so what we sort of think about is, okay, is the conflict that is there because of this generation gap? So again, is this generation gap fact or fiction? And what the research actually tells us is that adolescents are more similar to their parents than their peers on core issues and values. And if you actually sit back for a minute, that makes perfect sense, right? Because your parents are of the same rough socioeconomic status as you. I mean, you live in their house. You're oftentimes dependent on their financial standing, whether it's good or bad. They're probably the same religion as you, or you've been brought up perhaps in a house with multiple religions or even no religion, but that's what your parents adhere to as well. In terms of the big values, those tend to be similar between adolescents and their parents, okay? And also same cultural background is another aspect. So what is it that adolescents and parents tend to have conflict about? Well, it's the things that adolescents are more similar to their peers on, and that largely has to do with personal taste. So taste in music, taste in clothing, taste in hairstyles, hair colors, deciding which, school bag or book bag to get, right? You might want something really flashy and fun, and your parents are like, well, you should get something more practical. Well, you'll have a fight about that because it's your school bag. You're the one carrying it every day, not them. So you want what you want, and that seems perfectly reasonable to you. And that's probably going to line up more with your peers than your parents. But on big issues, you're probably a lot closer to your parents than your peers. So again, this takes us into this question of, what do adolescents and parents usually fight about? And what we find is that adolescents aren't just looking to pick fights for no reason. They're not looking to have conflict or create conflict with their parents for no reason. What they really will do is they will dig their heels in on how to define things. And this really comes down to as to whether it's like a personal thing that should be under the adolescent's control, or if it makes sense to them why their parents would want to have some input or some control over it. So for example, a parent may say, this is my house, so you have to follow my rules. And the adolescent might say, well, okay, but when it comes to my room, it's my rules. right? So parents may say, if you are having a snack in the living room, it's really important that you take the dishes back to the kitchen and that you wipe up after yourself. And the adolescent might think, well, I don't want to do that, so I'm going to take the snack up to my bedroom. And they take the snack to their bedroom and they leave their dirty dishes and crumbs and they've spilled milk all over the place. And their parent says, that's disgusting. You're a gross human being, because that sometimes happens. And the adolescent says, hey, my room, my rules. I'll clean up in the living room, or I just won't use the living room, but my room, my rules. And of course the parent is like, well, actually your room is part of my house, so my house, my rules. And that's where adolescents and parents might get into it, okay? So family relationships at adolescence. What we know, and so again, remember that I do use the headings from your textbook, so sometimes things will be like, redundant, maybe a little. So a time of reorganization and change. We know that family systems, that any system that exists out there likes to function in equilibrium. We like things to be the way they are. And even if that means that what we're used to is chaotic, it's our familiar chaos. And if an element of that chaos changes, we're like, wait, what just happened here? So families find a way to function in balance. And when one member of that system, so we now have this child who is entering into adolescence and they are making different demands on the environment, they're responding to the environment differently. The family system first says, oh my goodness, that shouldn't be happening. And they try to like sort of squash down the child and say, no, 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 you're upsetting the balance. And this doesn't happen in those words. This is more happening on a subconscious level, that the family really wants to make sure that things stay balanced. But the adolescent is like, no, hey, I'm growing, I'm changing, I'm thinking differently. Things have got to change around here. And so the family as a system has to change to accommodate the changing adolescent and to make room for that experience in this family system. And that's where, when I was saying earlier, that when you have more than one adolescent at a time, it can be that much more difficult because they're in different stages of adolescence. And so you've just gotten to a point where you've reset your equilibrium and then boom, just kidding, we're gonna change that again. Okay. Okay. Now, another factor that has been a factor, and I've asterisked this here on the slide because I think this might be something interesting for us to talk about when we have our discussion group, is thinking about the adolescent's parents at midlife. And what has been talked about is this idea of midlife meets adolescence, that parents are in the midst of their midlife crisis as their child enters adolescence. And so in the book, they talk about how when people tend to have their first child at around the age of 30, when that child is entering adolescence, the parents are in their early 40s or mid 40s if they were a couple years later. And they're entering that period known as the midlife crisis, the, oh my gosh, I've lived, half my life. Is this all I'm going to accomplish? What else is going to happen for me? And so parents are struggling a little bit with their own identity and their own sort of thoughts about mortality as well. Now, that may be changing as people are starting to have children later and later. In fact, when their child enters adolescence, they may be getting closer to the point of getting the seniors discount. So we might see some changes in that. But again, the research won't bear that out for another 15, 20 years or so. Okay. So again, when we think about this, why is this a problem that the adolescent is just starting to bloom into an adult and the parents are maybe having trouble with it? There's all these reminders of things, right? So as an adolescent is going through puberty, it is essentially the beginning of their fertile period and the time when they will be creating life potentially down the line when they're older, more responsible, more settled. And parents may be realizing, oh, wait a second, those days are over for me, right? So as a teenage girl is having the onset of her menstrual cycle, her mother might be starting to go through menopause. And so that can be really challenging. Again, not always on a conscious level, but that can be really challenging on a subconscious level. And also then thinking about all the possibilities in the future. For an adolescent who's taking different courses and thinking about college majors and thinking about careers and all the great things they're going to do in life, and their parents are going, hey, wait, I've sort of hit the pinnacle of my career, which basically means this is what I'm doing from now until retirement, and then I'm going to die. So parents struggle with that. So here's their adolescent who's full of ideas and energy and great plans for the future, and the parents are like, will the technology have improved by the time I need a hip replacement, right? So it's a very different mindset, and there can be some clashing there. Parents might not be as excited for their children getting older because it also means they're getting older. They might not be as excited about their children discovering their passions and their careers and launching because they realize they're on the decline. So that certainly is something that can impact how the family system is functioning as well. Of course, we also have to consider changes in family needs and functions. There are often financial pressures that accompany adolescence. Adolescents want expensive things, whether it's cars, latest video gaming systems, cell phones, right? All those things that cost money. And then in addition, we talked about with puberty, the growth spurt. So that means clothes and shoes, right? This also might be a time where adolescents are no longer happy to have mom or dad cut their hair at the at-home barber shop. So now they need, again, some of those personal care services. So they might want to have their hair done. They might want to have their nails done, things that all cost money. So there are some financial pressures there as well. And what we're seeing is that sometimes when parents have an adolescent, they may also be trying to take care of their parents and supporting them financially. And so those parents are what are called the sandwich generation, and they're just getting pressed on all sides in terms of finances, and that can be really tricky to navigate. Okay. I had made in my notes here also the ACTS budget. It seems like for adolescent males, a lot of the things that we think of as expenses are for adolescent girls. But of course, with the emergence of Axe body spray and the way that some younger adolescent males use it, there has to be a separate budget line for that as well. I knew I had something funny to say there. I just had to find it. Another change that happens, of course, is the increasing importance of the peer group. And so that means that adolescents want to spend more time with their friends and their family. They also are wanting to sort of test ideas out with their peers and maybe do things that their parents might not have approved of, but their peers do. So there's going to be some change, and there could be some conflict there, particularly if parents don't like the peers that you're hanging out with, if they're concerned about the influence your peers are having on you. So there are things that can happen that certainly change the way the family functions as well. And then I just want to touch briefly on some of the special concerns for immigrant families. Oftentimes for immigrant families, we see, wrong arrow, Carrie, there we go. We see that the role of the family is very different. Usually it's the family plays a more central role. And we're going to see differences based on whether it's a family that has immigrated where the children were already, like the children had been born in another country, and then at what age they immigrated to the US. And so I'm thinking in particular about one of my friend's families where she was the youngest of 4 kids when they immigrated, and so she was the one who became the most acculturated into our North American culture, whereas 2 of her older siblings really adhered to sort of the family structure and sort of the rules and the ways of being from their former country. And that created conflict in her family specifically, but what we'll often see with immigrant families is increasing conflict when they have either a young child or a child who is born in North America, but the family is still adhering to values and traditions from their former country, more so than when the child has come with the family as an immigrant into late childhood adolescence, where they might still really value the family. So that's a factor as well. And then yes, this idea of generational dissonance as the adolescent takes on the new country's values and ways while the parents may cling to the past. So once again, I have proved that I have to look at my notes before I just talk because there was the point I was just making. Okay, so Another thing that we need to consider, another aspect we need to consider is this transformation in family relations and the changes in the balance of power. So this is kind of a little fun to think about, right? Parents, and I'm the parent of a younger child, so she wants to think she has power, but she has none. At least not on the big things, right? The things that and again, I think children and adolescents need to be given a little bit of power. That's part of how they figure things out for themselves. So in my mind, they're the things that like, really, it's not gonna matter. So as an example, she got a haircut last week. I like her hair when it's long. I like being able to do things with her hair. I think it suits her, it looks good, it's fun. She prefers her hair short. And so I decided a couple of haircuts ago that this was not going to be an issue. It's her hair, her choice. I can give her that power. Now, if she were to tell me she wants to shave her head at the age of 5 or get a mohawk at the age of 5, I might have something to say about it. But ultimately, the hairdresser started cutting her hair and said, "Is this good?" And my daughter looked at her and said, "No, a little shorter." And she looked at me and said, "Mom," and I said, "Oh, it's what she wants." Right? So I can hand over hair length deciding power, no problem. But if my child's like, "You know, Mom, I really want to stay up and watch a movie tonight. And I really just want to eat junk food for dinner. And then I really want to wake you up all night long because the movie was too scary and my belly hurts from eating junk food." I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no 3 times. I'm going to say no movie, no junk food, no waking me up all night, right? That's not power I'm going to let my child have. And so these are the types of things we start seeing, though, in adolescence. So an adolescent wants to go see a movie, and the parents say, "Well, what's the rating?" And the adolescent is thinking, R, but they can't say that, so they're like, PG-13, and the parent goes, "Really? You sure about that? Because I thought I saw an ad for that, and it was rated R," and the adolescent suddenly is like, I think they thought they were going to rate it R, but then when they released it in this market, they decided PG-13 was better, right? And so, because adolescents are quick thinkers and quick talkers too. So that's some of the places where we start seeing that struggle for power. I want to decide what media I consume, right? It's cute that all these different like media things put in parental controls. Show me a 14-year-old who can't work around them. Please show me a 14-year-old who cannot work around them, right? So now, in fact, with us not going to movies, and with everybody just sitting home watching Netflix, you can watch whatever you want, more or less, because you can find the workaround if you're a savvy enough teen. But we start seeing that drive to make more decisions and have a little more power, a little more say in the family structure. We talked in one of the previous classes about that sort of defining moment of adolescence when you move from the kids' table to the grown-up table at big family gatherings. So those are some of the things that happen in terms of this idea of power. In terms of sex differences in family relationships, this probably isn't that surprising, but adolescents, both male and female, are closer to their mothers and spend more time with them. Now, some of that is kind of the historical dad worked outside of the home, mom either was a homemaker, a stay-at-home mom, or worked part-time or worked in a child-rearing friendly job like being a teacher at her children's school, right? So she had the same hours, same days as her child. So children were around mom more. That's, of course, changing. We're seeing fathers doing more in terms of family. We're also seeing mothers working outside of the home and in all sorts of different job placements. But we do see in adolescence still this distancing away from dads a little bit for both boys and girls, spending more time and feeling closer to their mothers, but not saying that they don't feel close to their fathers, they just feel closer to their mothers. Now, probably the biggest thing to really think about in terms of adolescent development in families has to do with parenting styles. And this is something that I'm gonna hope that you've heard about before, probably in one of your other developmental classes, but it is important for us to spend a few minutes on it today. So this is based on Diana Baumrein's work. She identified 2 dimensions of parenting: responsiveness and demandingness. And as a result of that, came up with 4 styles of parenting. And I'm going to sort of direct you over to page 108 of your text, figure 4.4, just to get a visual on it. But the 4 types of parenting are authoritative, authoritarian, indulgent, and indifferent. And authoritative, which is high responsiveness and high demandingness, is what is found over and over and over and over and over and over and over again to be the best parenting style for most adolescents, most children in general. Now, there are going to be exceptions. There are going to be some kids that, because of mental health issues, physical health issues, developmental disabilities, that's not going to work. But for most, we see the best development with authoritative parenting. And this is where parents are highly responsive to their child. That doesn't mean that they coddle them, but it means that when their child has a concern, when their child needs help, they're there to help them. There was just recently, I think it was on Reddit, I don't remember, there was a teenager who apparently, or it was either like an older child or a young teen who was hungry, and all they could find was like a can of beans and a manual can opener, right? And so the dad said, and they were like, how do I use this? And the dad was like, figure it out. And apparently hours went by. And I don't think the child ever figured it out. I think the dad finally sort of rescued them. And this caused a lot of negative comments on social media, of course. And I was like, that dad's an ass, right? Like, your kid is hungry, help them. And the dad was thinking, well, I want them to figure it out. Like, they have to figure out how to use a can opener. And again, we don't know the backstory, how many times the child had previously seen someone using the can opener. But that wasn't necessarily the best. That was high demandingness, but fairly low responsiveness, right? That would sort of go into our more authoritarian parenting. An authoritative parent in that same situation would say, okay, you're hungry. Have you looked around the kitchen? Is there any food available that you can eat without needing my help? Because at that moment, the dad was doing something else. And the child says, no. In fact, the kitchen is pretty bare. There's nothing. There's nothing in our entire house except this can of beans, and I don't know how to open it. And the parent says, okay, well, can you find a tool? Like cavemen used to figure things out with stone. Teenager smartly says, they didn't have cans back then, Dad, right? They didn't have to get an aluminum can open. So Dad says, okay, well, I can tell you that in the second drawer on the left, there's this really weird looking thing, but it'll open the can. And so the child goes to the kitchen and retrieves the can opener and says, okay, got it. And the dad says, figure it out. That's our authoritarian. Our authoritative says, okay, have you ever seen one of these before? And the kid says, no. Well, the dad says, how did you think cans opened? And the kid says, well, I've seen a lot of cans with flip tops, right? So you just sort of pop that and you plug. And the dad says, okay, fair. And what about other cans? Well, I've never really thought about it because I've never really been that involved with food prep. So cans get opened, but I've never seen it happen. The dad says, okay. So let me show you how this works. And they explain the mechanics of it, and they explain how you grip it on, and you wait to hear that little like pop, and then you turn the little handle, and it moves around the can, and then boom. And so maybe the parent doesn't open it for them because they might be going into sort of this indulgent, high responsiveness, low demandingness. Oh, you don't have to trouble yourself with that. I'll do it for you. But they're saying, okay, like I want you to figure this out, but I know that you need some help. So let me show you how to latch it on, and I'll explain the process, and then I'll watch you do it so that you get to have the experience and do it yourself. That would be our authoritative parenting, right? Highly responsive, saying you have a problem, you don't know how to fix it, you're coming to me for help, and I am going to help you. I'm going to be responsive, but I'm also going to be demanding in that I'm going to ask you to be an active participant of solving this problem. I'm not just going to solve it for you. Whereas the authoritarian parent just says, here's the can of beans, here's the can opener, figure it out. 6 hours later, you're still sitting there staring at it. The indulgent parent says, oh my goodness, all we have is a can of beans. Well, let me take you right away to the McDonald's drive-thru, and then we'll go to the supermarket and buy all your favorite foods, right? So very indulgent, very permissive, very responsive. You need food, let me go get it, but not asking you to do anything. And then indifferent parent would be like, oh, okay. And they'd mosey on, right? Like they just don't really respond and they don't really demand much. So authoritative is definitely what we see leads to the best development. Indulgent is what most people think they want. They want that parent who lets them do whatever they want, who doesn't expect a whole lot from them, except oftentimes we find that people who do grow up with indulgent parents and see some of their friends having authoritative parents are like, I kind of wish my parents were more like yours. Like, I kind of wish they expected a little bit more out of me. That's the demandingness part. Authoritarian, the low responsiveness, high demandingness is a lot more of what we think of as a typical like military family. These are the rules, this is what's happening, this is what you're doing, but not showing a whole lot of affection and responsiveness. And then the indifferent is basically our neglectful parent who just doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to you. In terms of some ethnic differences in parenting practices, well, we are going to see in minority groups, we're less likely to see parents who are authoritative. We're going to see some indulgent, we're going to see some authoritarian. We're less likely to see authoritative, so what that also tells us is that maybe that should be or could be part of what we do to help people when they immigrate explain some parenting practices. And again, not to say that other ways of parenting aren't good, because they are, and they've worked for generations. But again, when you're coming to a different culture, it might sometimes be helpful to know what the research is supporting. But it might also not work, right? So within a given culture, it might not work to shift to authoritative parenting because what everyone is accustomed to is more authoritarian. And that's what is breeding success. So again, we're less likely to see authoritative, which we know tends to be the better one. It doesn't mean that within different cultural groups that other parenting is wrong or bad. Okay, I want to be really clear about that. And then in terms of adolescents' relationships with siblings, we're going to say more about this in a couple of slides, but for any of you who have siblings, probably not shocking to know it's likely to be a source of conflict. Adolescents and their siblings tend to not get along that well, but typically, but not always, they will emerge from adolescence closer. But during adolescence, there's all sorts of stuff that happens, and like I said, we're going to get to that in a couple of slides. This is where I want to also let you know that the answer to quiz question 9 is A. So for quiz question 9, the answer is A. In terms of genetic influences on adolescent development, we want to think about the fact that there are genetic and environmental influences. Really big component that we need to consider are the shared and non-shared environmental influences. Shared influences are factors in the environment that people have in common and that make them similar in behavior and personality. So 2 siblings, 2 adolescents growing up in the same home who are of the same socioeconomic status, brought up with the same religion, with the same set of parents, that's going to lead to some similarities between them. But then when we talk about the non-shared environmental influences, we're talking about factors in the environment that are not similar and that can differentiate between the siblings. So as an example, my brother and I went to the same elementary school. And so we had a lot of shared environmental influences. We had lived in the same house, had the same parents, went to the same school. So we had the same school schedule and all that. We had some of the same teachers. So yes, we were in different grades. We had different friends, but a lot of our experience was the same. But then we went to different high schools. And in fact, I went to an all-girls school and he went to a co-ed school. Those definitely were non-shared environment. Like he was not allowed to set foot in my school except for like a school play type of situation. So that influenced us in different ways. That's some of the non-shared. We still lived in the same house, still had the same parents, still practiced the same religion, still had some of the same friends that we had had in elementary school, still talked about some of our similar experiences from elementary school. But then we had these non-shared environmental influences as well. Same thing with sports. We participated in different sports. So we had different influences from our extracurricular activities that influenced how we developed and what happened, okay? What we know is that genetic and the non-shared environmental influences are particularly strong in adolescence. So again, we've talked briefly about genetics earlier. The idea is that we have inherited traits and tendencies, and that those will materialize. Sometimes they just do, like your eye color is genetically determined, but other things in terms of personality traits might develop based on circumstances. And so that's where, again, in adolescence, we see the genetic component and this non-shared environmental influence being particularly strong in terms of who we are. Differential susceptibility to the environment. So this is kind of interesting. So we have what you are all probably familiar with, and as a clinical psychologist, probably one of the models that I talk about the most is the idea of the diathesis stress model. And the diathesis stress model says we are all born with a host of predispositions to things, and under the right stress, whatever that may be, those things will materialize or not. And of course, in the world of abnormal, we're typically talking about disorders. So that's where I tend to think about it, right? So you may have been born with a genetic predisposition towards developing schizophrenia, but you never had the right stressors to bring that out, right? So you never developed schizophrenia. Some researchers have said, like, yeah, okay, diathesis stress really tends to focus on like this negative side of things. What about this differential susceptibility theory, which actually suggests that susceptibilities can lead to problems or to thriving based on the conditions. So maybe I'm someone who is more susceptible to being detail-oriented. In calculus, which I did not understand and I still don't understand, that led to distress because I really wanted every detail to be perfect, but I honestly felt like my calculus professor was speaking Chinese because I did not understand anything going on there. On the other hand, when I took statistics and everything in my brain went, ooh, this makes sense, probability statistics, this is good, that attention to detail helped me be successful because I made sure I always was using the right formula and plugging in the right numbers. And we know how p-values are so important. So that same idea for other things in adolescence, that we have these traits, we have these tendencies that under the right conditions will either blossom and thrive or can become problematic. And that's the differential susceptibility theory. Now, why are siblings often so different? Great question. Genetics is part of it. Again, other than identical twins, any sibling pair, whether they are fraternal twins or dizygotic twins or any other sibling pair, they only share 50% of their genetics. So that's going to lead to differences right off the bat. But then we're also going to talk about differential treatment within family. Different kids demand different things of the family and the environment in general right from the minute they're born. And parents don't usually do things exactly the same with each child. And you know what children are really great at? Determining if their sibling is getting something they're not, whether it's good or bad, right? If you have a sibling, you know that you were very attuned to whether they got 2 milliliters more lemonade at the picnic in 1997 than you did, because that's the type of thing siblings pay attention to. So if one sibling is getting more attention, and again, whether this is attention for good or bad, but if it's known that one sibling is getting more attention, or if parents have identified one sibling as the smart one and one as the, well, let's just hope to get them married off one, and they put their time and money and attention into them in considering those things, siblings realize. So this is not to say if and when you have children or if you currently have children, you must treat them all equally. No, because that's not going to work either. They're going to want different things. But I think the big thing is knowing that you would, so if you have one child who is really into music and is really excelling and really, really wants some private lessons so that they're ready to audition for a conservatory spot, and if you know that if your other child had a passion and a talent and a drive and that you would be willing to invest that same amount of money in that child, yeah, go for it. Get them those private lessons. Don't feel like you have to compensate and get the child who doesn't want to play an instrument private lessons in an instrument. That's just going to make them bitter and resent you. It also doesn't mean that you have to then say, okay, well, we're spending, $12,000 on your sibling, therefore we need to spend $12,000 on you at this moment in time. No, you don't. But it's about making sure that your children's needs are being met, and that when you're able to provide sort of those extras, that you do it in an equitable fashion, right? It doesn't mean at the end of every day. You don't have to measure how much lemonade you pour your children at a family picnic, but they will remember if one got more and one got less. I promise you that, okay? And so, of course, this differential treatment within the family can lead to sibling rivalry. Not surprising. And then the other reason that siblings are often so different is, again, these different experiences outside of the home. So with friends, with schools, how family members treat them, with sports, all those other things that happen outside of the home will have an influence on how each adolescent develops. Okay, so the last sort of thing before we get to the article is thinking about families in a changing society. And of course, divorce is something that is happening quite frequently, quite regularly. And it's been happening for long enough that we've been able to collect the data and to identify, what are some of the issues, what are some of the outcomes. We know that for most adolescents and most children, they are better off with parents who are not together than parents who are staying together just for the sake of the children, but modeling all sorts of terrible relationship behavior, terrible behavior to each other. We also know that some families don't have the luxury of being able to divorce because divorce is expensive. So the economic impact is something we have to consider. If parents divorce and your lifestyle suddenly gets completely upended because now your parents are supporting two households, and so now you can't do the extracurriculars, and they're going to change your school, and you're going to move to a different neighborhood, that might not be as positive as having your parents stop fighting, right? So that is a factor that we do have to consider. So some of the different aspects to consider are the conflict between the parents, also if parents are dragging their children into the conflict, which is totally not cool, by the way. Also then issues surrounding remarriage, and particularly if the parents remarry and then there are potentially step siblings who are brought into the mix, and if parents remarry and have additional children and now there's half siblings who are brought into the mix, all of that can be quite complicated, particularly during adolescence. And then, as I was mentioning, the economic impact. In terms of other special family forms, here in the text they talk about adoption, LGBTQ parents, and then foster care. Adoption is a wonderful thing, right? So if someone is unable to raise a child and they are able to give that child a chance at having a supportive, loving family, that's amazing, right? That's just flat out amazing. If the child who is adopted, though, is upset about that, the fact that they were adopted, if they find that perhaps their adoptive parents treat them differently than their biological children, if they have a lot of questions about their biological parents and they're not getting answers, and also depending on what the reasons were surrounding the adoption. So if it's a child who was seized at birth because a parent had been involved in criminal activity or in drugs and alcohol, there could be impacts on the child. So no matter how wonderful the adoptive family are, some of those behaviors, traits may be there. So we can see some conflict and some increased delinquency with adoption, but it's not a for sure thing. In terms of LGBTQ parents, I want to be incredibly clear about something. And so as such, I highlighted something in the textbook, and I'm going to read it to you verbatim because I think it is important. I know that you don't all read the textbook. I know that you don't all read the textbook thoroughly. There's some skimming that happens. So I want to be very, very clear in terms of what happens for children with LGBTQ parents. There is no evidence whatsoever that children or adolescents with lesbian or gay parents are psychologically different from those with straight parents, a finding that has now been replicated numerous times across many different domains of psychological development, including gender identity and sexual orientation. No evidence that they are any different. That's a really important point, because you will hear people say, oh no, they're a lesbian couple, or they're a gay couple, or that parent is transgender. They are not going to be good parents. Bullshit. No other parents get scrutinized as much. No other people are questioned as much when they want to have children. No other parents some other parents do have to go to extreme lengths to have their children, but a gay male couple, two men, cannot just have a baby, right? They have to involve someone else in the process. And that means there's forms, there's legalities, there's costs, right? Other people don't have to do that. Man and a woman want to have a baby, boom, they have a baby. I mean, again, there sometimes are cases where they have to go to these other extremes. But there is zero evidence that having LGBTQ parents is psychologically damaging in any way, shape, or form. And that is a really important point to drive home. And then, of course, thinking about special family forms, foster care. Foster care is really, again, a mixed bag. Some people are living with families of origin that are just so dysfunctional and so dangerous that even a terrible foster family is better than their family of origin. In some cases, foster families are not better than their family of origin. They just put on a happy face and clean up for the social worker better. So again, that's going to be a mixed bag in terms of what that's like for an adolescent. The challenge, of course, with foster care is that children will age out of the system in adolescence, and we don't have a ton of good supports when that happens. Okay, and this takes us to the additional material for discussion, which is an article. So please read the following article prior to our class meeting and prior to taking the quiz. It's by Lan and Soon. It's Exploring Psychosocial Adjustment Profiles in Chinese Adolescents from Divorced Families, the Interplay of Parental Attachment and Adolescence Gender. So again, just thinking about divorce in another culture where divorce was not as accessible and not as mainstream as it has been in North America. And then for your reflection, if you're not sure where to start, you can choose to use any of these questions as a guide. Do you think the experience of the Chinese adolescents in the study is similar or different to Canadian adolescents? Why or why not? Why do you think there are gender differences with secure maternal attachment patterns? And do you think divorce should be stigmatizing? And thus concludes the chapter on families.